Welcome to Your Life Reset, a Virta Health podcast series. I'm your host, Teresa Link, and in this series, we'll hear from people on their Virta journey, the wins, failures, moments of adversity, and moments of joy they're experiencing along the way. So sit back, relax, and listen as we unwrap the truly human experience of Virta. Hey there, listeners. Welcome back. I'm Teresa Link, dietitian and content creator at Virta. Today, you're getting quite the treat, a history lesson on dietary fat that is chock full of controversy. For years, we've been told that fat is bad, but our guest, Nina Teicholz, is here to challenge everything we thought we knew. Nina Teicholz is an investigative science journalist and author of The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. She also founded the Nutrition Coalition with the late Dr. Sarah Hallberg and has passionately advocated for science-based dietary guidelines. So get ready for an exciting perspective that might change how you think about food and your health. Hi, Nina. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Teresa. It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited that you're here, and I'm so excited to talk about fat, my favorite subject. So first, Nina, tell us just a bit about yourself. What got you into journalism, and how did you end up diving into science and nutrition?
Yeah, I've been a journalist for a long time. I worked for National Public Radio. I had written for most of the major publications in the US. And then I was doing a series of stories for Gourmet magazine about they were some of the first investigative stories in the world of food. Food really had not been much treated as like a business subject. And one of those stories that was assigned to me was on trans fats. This is the early 2000s. Like, who knew what trans fats were? I didn't know. I didn't know anything about nutrition. I was a vegetarian. I was a good 20 pounds heavier than I am now. I just had all the conventional beliefs about nutrition. So I dove into this world of trans fats. I did a story for Gourmet on trans fats. That was one of the most popular stories they had ever run in recent history. And it led to, first of all, it was completely revelatory, and we can talk about that. But it led to a book contract that I was supposed to write on trans fats. And then the book contract dragged on and on and on. But I also realized I wanted to write a book about dietary fat more generally. And
Okay.
once you start researching, you realize like fat is what is the macronutrient that we have obsessed about most, good fat, bad fat, low fat, what kind of fat to eat or not to eat. And so that just took me 9 years of hundreds of interviews with scientists around the world and reading thousands and thousands of scientific papers to, for my purposes, get to the bottom of that story. So my book is really about, the book that came out of that is really about it's about the science, which I try to make really readable and understandable, but it's also a book about the politics, the corporate interests of various non-science influences that come into forming our ideas about what is a healthy diet.
Yeah, and during my introduction earlier, I had let all of our listeners know that there's a bit of controversy in this book. There's a lot of, you go back into the history, and I remember reading it for the first time and thinking, oh my gosh, everybody needs to read this book. This is amazing. This is just, it just really, really got me fired up. I'm fired up all over again. Um, but it sounds like you really starting to dive into the world of trans fats, which, as you said, in the early 2000s was still kind of, we were still kind of learning about these, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that then inspired you to want to really look more into dietary fat as a whole, which sounds like that's what sparked the Big Fat Surprise. So now what I would love to hear from you, you mentioned you read thousands of papers, did hundreds of interviews with other scientists, journalists. During your research for this book, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about dietary fat?
Well, really the central focus of my book is how we got it wrong on saturated fats, the fats in meat and dairy that we've been told since 1961, that idea did become policy in a particular point in time. We've been told to avoid those whole fat natural foods in favor of polyunsaturated oils, or like replacing butter with margarine. And I discovered that that had been based on almost no science, had then been tested in large randomized controlled clinical trials, really the gold standard, and it could never be shown to be true. And and plus there's just an enormous body of evidence to the contrary, that we have been eating these fats since the beginning of humankind, long before the rise in chronic diseases. And so ultimately what my book does is sort of turn the good fat, bad fat story on its head. That saturated fats are the good fats, polyunsaturated, what we now call seed oils or plant oils, are maybe not as good as we think they are. And my book also has, I think, a pretty great chapter on olive oil and the Mediterranean diet and how that whole story took off in the 1990s, which is basically a story about the European Olive Oil Council funding fantastic vacations in the Mediterranean diet to promote that as a diet.
Oh my.
So that's just one of the stories in there. But really the focus is how we wrongly vilified saturated fats, and the fats that we replaced them with are not as healthy.
So you mentioned that long before we started having all of these chronic diseases, we were eating saturated fats. When did that shift begin, and what was behind that shift?
The story really starts in the 1950s when heart disease had risen from out of nowhere. Very few cases of heart disease in the early 1900s. It had been identified in textbooks. Doctors knew what it was, but they just were not seeing cases. Rose to become the #1 killer of middle-aged men by the 1950s. In 1955, President Eisenhower has a heart attack. He's out of the Oval Office for 10 days, a long time. And the entire focus of the nation is on what causes heart disease. And really, there were no good explanations. There were a number of competing hypotheses. One was lack of vitamins, adequate vitamins. Another was the rising tide of auto exhaust that was happening with more cars on the street. Another one was the type A personality, where you run around screaming at everybody and then, have a heart attack. But the winning theory was proposed by a scientist named Ancel Keys from the University of Minnesota. And his idea was that it was dietary cholesterol and saturated fats that clog the arteries, cause your blood cholesterol to go up, and give you a heart attack. Like pouring hot oil down a cold stovepipe. That was the idea. And he called that the diet heart hypothesis. And Ancel Keys was an incredibly charismatic and aggressive and I would say egotistical scientist. He really believed he was right. His colleagues said he could argue anyone to the death. He was very persuasive and also a bit of a bully. And he was able to get onto the nutrition committee at the American Heart Association and swing that committee around such that in 1961, the American Heart Association issues the first advice anywhere in the world telling people to avoid saturated fat and dietary cholesterol as the best measure to prevent heart attacks. So that's really the tiny acorn, the original kernel of advice that grew into the giant oak tree that we have today.
Wow. So this scientist, Ancel Keys, had this idea and used his charisma to make this policy change out of basically nothing? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, first of all, you have to understand there's this panic in the nation and the need for ideas. And the American Heart Association is the leading organization in the country providing people advice on heart disease. And it feels, from the internal memos that I have from that time, they feel hugely compelled to say something. So So there was, so they reacted to the public panic and the need for them to provide guidance.
Gotcha. There
At
was a need to point the finger somewhere to
right,
give people some sense of calm.
and there, it's not that there was nothing. There were some tiny little human trials that Ansel Keys had done. There was a little bit of animal data that was suggestive, but there really had been no clinical trials on humans. I mean, there was a partially done large observational study called the 7-country study that is very famous.
Yes.
And was conducted by Ansel Keys, and he had partially completed this study, and but the final data from that was not yet in. So really, there was very little data on which to found this highly influential advice that came out of the American Heart Association.
Wow. Walk me through the next couple of decades. How did our food intake start to change?
Well, let me just cover first what happened with the science, because I think that's really interesting, which is that Ansel Keys' idea, the diet heart hypothesis, really caught on like wildfire. Everybody wanted some explanation. The diet heart hypothesis was it. It was adopted by not only the American Heart Association, but the National Institutes of Health. And it became very quickly the sort of prevailing dogma. Scientists around the world realized the paucity, the lack of adequate, rigorous data for this. And so what happened in the 1960s and 70s is that teams of scientists all over the world, in the US, the UK, Finland, Norway, Australia, they all undertook largely government-funded studies to look at, to test the diet heart hypothesis. If you took a group of people in a clinical trial, half of them you give a high what was considered a normal saturated fat diet. At the time, a normal saturated fat diet was considered 18% of calories as saturated fat. Today, they're capped at 10%. So it's much higher than we consider to be normal. And the other group gets, instead of butter, they get margarine. Instead of regular milk, they get soy-filled milk. They have whatever version of the Impossible burger that, they were making at the time. They have a diet low in saturated fat and high in polyunsaturated fats. These experiments it happened. This is the most tested hypothesis anywhere in the world over any period of time. Altogether, 76,000 people were tested. I mean, when you see a large clinical trial make its way to the front page of the New York Times, large is like 200 people. This was 76,000 people going through these trials. And at the end of them, they universally concluded that saturated fats had no effect on cardiovascular mortality, which means dying from heart disease, or mortality, dying of any cause. And nearly all of them found little to no effect on cardiovascular events like heart attacks, stroke. And those are a little bit, that's less of a, those endpoints are a little bit harder to determine and much more subject to doctor variability. So the really solid endpoints are the mortality ones. And really what happened to that data is that in many cases, they weren't published. I have incredible stories about unpublished data literally in the basement of the National Institutes of Health, or they were ignored, or the scientists denied them. It's very common in scientific papers that don't come out the way the authors want them to or need them to in order to stay in with their professional community, to report the results, but just basically say in the abstract, we didn't find this, but it's not really, we still believe in this theory and more testing is needed, or they somehow downplay their results. So those results were never reckoned with, never reviewed by nobody in the U.S. official expert community, did not review them for our national policy, not reviewed by the American Heart Association. I mean, they were just ignored or actively suppressed, I would say.
75,000 subjects, just
76, yeah.
76,000 subjects just ignored completely, buried.
That information was effectively buried, yes. So
That is very scary.
it is scary. And to answer your first question, what happened with the American Heart Association advice was that Americans started to decrease their consumption of animal fats, animal foods, and increase their fruits, vegetables, whole grains, vegetable oils, like as we were told to do. So the numbers are really quite dramatic. I mean, the best available data shows 1970 to 2014 trends in America, and we increased our fruit consumption. Sorry, I think it's fruit availability by 30%. Vegetables are up by 20%. Grains are also up considerably. Vegetable oils up by 90%. Meanwhile, well, everything we were told to eat more of, we eat more of. Meanwhile, red meat is down by 28%. Beef, particularly, is down by 35%. Whole milk down by 79%. Butter, eggs, each down by about 15%. So we really followed that diet. And, that's because starting with the American Heart Association advice, all of a sudden there were ads in magazines saying, this is a cholesterol lowering product, this cereal or this oil, and take this to your doctor and get a prescription for vegetable oil, and make sure. In a lot of media about avoiding meat and avoiding cheese. You remember we were not eating egg yolks for a long time, or shellfish, due to their dietary cholesterol content. So the whole eating pattern of America changed dramatically in line with that guidance.
And people think that we're not following the guidance, that if people only followed what they were told, then we wouldn't have all this disease. But contrary to that, we as a collective people were following this guidance.
The Americans have followed the guidelines. And if anybody wants to see that data, I have a nonprofit called the Nutrition Coalition. You can go to nutritioncoalition.us. And on that page, on the homepage, is all that data. You can download it. You can check the original sources. So, right. I mean, the defense of our national nutrition guidance, which is often defended because nobody wants to think that we got it so wrong. We got it so wrong at such a high level. So the defense by experts is Americans don't follow the guidelines well enough. They're not compliant enough. But I really think the data does not support that statement.
I can see why the low saturated fat, low meat, low eggs, low butter, low cheese, thought has persisted for as long as it has. And we have started to see that turn around a bit, right? You had mentioned olive oil, and also there's been a resurgence in butter, although I would say still not everyone. But we're seeing that dietary fat is, maybe not as terrible for us as we thought, meaning just regular people walking around, right?
So the overall low-fat diet, which is since the 1960s, we were also told, in addition to removing saturated or lowering saturated fats and replacing it with polyunsaturated fats, we were also told to reduce our total fat to about 30% of calories, right? And that advice, also first issued by the American Heart Association, was based on the idea that fat as a macronutrient has about 9 calories per gram versus the other two macronutrients, which are protein and carbohydrate, which have 4 to 5 calories a gram. So in the 60s and 70s, as obesity was just starting to creep up, experts just hypothesized, because there was no real data, to say if we reduce our fat, we'll be eating fewer calories. So that must have a positive benefit on obesity rates. Well, that was based on no data. It turns out not to be true, because fat is uniquely satiating. It comes in foods like meat and dairy that also have protein, also satiating. And so it's those foods that help keep our hunger at bay. And so we need those foods in order to to feel satiated. But the low-fat diet was all the rage, especially in the 80s. If anybody remembers, we were all avoiding fat. And the great unintended consequence of the low-fat diet was that in order to replace the fat calories, we ramped up our carbohydrate calories. So,
Yes.
you know, I think it is a 30% more grains from 1970 to 2014, but we eat a lot more grains. The vast increase in calories that we now eat, like 270 from 1960 to today, we eat 270 more calories per day. Almost all of those are carbohydrate. So, and now we know that carbohydrates are uniquely fattening. They cause cravings and addictions, and they wreak havoc on our metabolic health overall. But and so this was, the low fat diet was this giant, uncontrolled experiment on the American public, and I think we can see from our health data that has really failed.
How did the food industry kind of move this along? You mentioned the 80s and then the 90s. I remember in being in school, second, third grade, early 90s, seeing the food guide pyramid, and it was potatoes, rice, bread all across the bottom, and any sort of fats or red meat or eggs all the way at the tippy tippy top. And so that was what we were supposed to eat most, right? And again, we were doing it. We were doing it. But I also remember there were so many products that were out there that were touting themselves as healthy because they were fat free. So how much of a role did that really play in shaping what it is that we were eating in those decades?
Well, I want to say that the government and industry sort of dovetail with each other in terms of influence. If the government started in 1980 issuing the dietary guidelines, the food pyramid came out in the 1990s. It really hasn't changed since then. It's still more than half your calories, 52 to 54% of your calories is carbohydrate, and then about 32% of your calories is fat, and the rest is protein. And so, and now there are proposals to further reduce red and processed meat and replace more animal foods with peas, beans, and legumes. So the government really drives the show in the sense that once the government says, this is what we think is a healthy diet, we are we're going to reward contracts for school lunches, women and infant children programs, feeding programs for the elderly, all these huge programs. I mean, the school lunch program is the biggest restaurant. If it were a restaurant, it's the biggest food provider in the country. So food companies get in line with government recommendations, including, the back of the package. If you buy something, you look on the back, and those percent values of are you getting enough of this or that macronutrient or vitamin, those are based on the food pyramid, and you really want your product to line up and look good. In fact, I once visited with a scientist at ADM, which is a giant food conglomerate, and he said, we start with what we want the food label to look like, and then we back engineer to the product. So like, oh, maybe this could be like a yogurt parfait, but they don't start with a food idea. They start with the label. That's how
Oh
powerful
my
that is for the
gosh.
food companies. So, um, but also, I think it's entirely fair to say the food industry is has every every part, every nook and cranny of the food industry is lobbying, has lobbyists in Washington. And of course, the most influential lobbyists are the ultra processed food companies. So the names you hear over and over, Unilever, Danone, Pepsi, Coke, Nestle. Yeah, I mean, those are the giant multinational ultra processed food companies that are by far the most influential. Also, Kellogg's and General Mills, I would put in that category.
So one thing I have noticed on a positive note is there has been, even though dietary carbohydrates have remained fairly steady in terms of recommendations, um, perhaps even higher, as you mentioned, wanting to have more dietary carbohydrates from, beans and legumes and peas and things like that. One thing I have noticed, over the years has been a decrease in, recommendations for sugar intake, added sugar, and we've seen, added sugar grams on the back of a food label. So that's been something that has been, I think, a positive driving force in terms of what people are eating, although you're seeing that now too. um Almost everything is 0 sugar, no added sugar, sugar-free, and so it's so interesting how you are seeing these products just come out of everywhere. And again, to your point, the scary part is we're not talking about starting with a food. We're talking about starting with a label and then working backwards with some of these ultra processed foods. And that is just very yeah, that's just very scary. And I was doing a podcast with Allison Zoller, who is on our research team, and she dove into that recent study all about ultra processed foods. I think came out in December or something. Um, and talking about how all of these products are engineered exactly so that we will want to get addicted to them. And so everything you're saying, all of this continues to be an issue, and it seems like we are just having such a hard time figuring out what to eat. And I think a lot of it we've gotten so far away from just eating the foods that we always used to eat, just the whole natural foods, and we've just gotten so obsessed with these like kind of sciency foods that are somehow going to improve our health.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people know that ultra processed foods are junk foods. I don't think anybody needs the term ultra processed food. I don't know why that improves upon just junk food. You go into the supermarket and it's really obvious what is junk food. I mean, Cocoa Krispies, Fruit Loops, all that's super obvious. Candy, super obvious. And it doesn't really, I think the things that are maybe confusing to people are, oh, is this extruded zucchini puff a healthy food or not? I mean, maybe that's where people get into trouble. But, I think, and sugar is uniquely bad I think particularly because it's so addictive. Sugar is the only nutrient that is actually found to be addictive. And then sugar plus fat can also be addicted, but fat on its own is not addictive. And that's the harm of sugar. But I think that uh, looking at the sugar contents of food is not as important as looking at the total carbohydrate content, because it's all the scientific experiments that have been done to show reversal of disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome, fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. They're all done in clinical trials reducing total carbohydrates. So if you're reducing sugar, that's great. But if you are then loading up on starches and grains and even quinoa, you will not see the results that you want to see, unfortunately.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting. I do imagine, kind of in the wild, if someone is reducing their intake of added sugars, they're probably also trying to implement other healthy lifestyle behaviors as well. Perhaps more try to improve the quality of their sleep, or exercising, or maybe eating less bread overall, trying to get more vegetables, the non-starchy ones. So there definitely could be some confounders here as well. But I think that's a great message that it's not just singling out one type of carbohydrate. It's the carbohydrates as a whole that really are playing the biggest role in disease, and our ability, if we progress in disease, or our ability to reverse our
To
disease.
reverse it. I mean, what
Yeah.
messes people up is just as much sugar in dark bread and whole wheat bread as white bread. Just as much sugar in, like quinoa has a lot of sugar. Legumes, peas, beans, we think of those as healthy, but they're full of a lot of starch, which translate into our bodies as sugar. Fruit, which we've been told, is one of the healthiest things you can eat. Most fruits are very high in sugar. So again, not a problem if you don't have a metabolic condition, a chronic disease condition, but it's a problem if you do have a condition and need to reverse it.
Yes. So Nina, you had mentioned that you used to be a vegetarian.
Yes.
Did all of this research kind of influence your own eating habits?
Yeah, I mean, of course it did. I mean, it took a while. I really had to convince myself that it was okay to eat meat. I hadn't eaten red meat in decades. Didn't feel comfortable with really full fat cheese, butter, always tried to make everything low fat. But as I read the science, I came to understand that that had really been flawed. And so over time, gradually, some people, they understand it, and it's just like a flip switches, and from one day to the next, they can just get it. But for me, it really took time, and it took quite a little bit of time before I felt comfortable cooking red meat. Um, and now, I've been on a pretty low carbohydrate diet or ketogenic diet for more than a decade. And I'm pretty much mostly carnivore now. I mostly eat animal foods. So, and I mean, it's great. I mean, like I'm like everyone else on these diets, which is great mood, no problem with energy, effortlessly keeping my weight low, not having any infections, or I just don't even get sick or get the flu anymore the way I used to. So it's been great. I mean, I feel fantastic on this
It's
diet.
wonderful.
I think, like most people, once you sort of get the hang of it, you're just unlikely ever to go back to your old way of eating.
I too was I was not a vegetarian, but I was definitely, as a dietitian following those guidelines and trying to have very little meat, mostly chicken. Um, didn't really like fish until I got into fatty fish, and then I really started to like fish. But yeah, trying to keep everything, lean and green. And yeah, whole wheat bread, brown rice, all of that. Although for me, I always struggled with massive cravings and just having blood sugar drops all throughout the day and just feeling out of control. And it wasn't until I changed my eating to a ketogenic lifestyle as well that I've been able to find so many of those positive changes. So I completely understand and recognize what you mean by that. And when you just feel so much better, that's such a motivation. Now that's to say we have a lot of our members who don't eat meat, and they can be very successful, I think, as long as it's separating out the it for reversing their chronic disease. It's about the carbohydrates, right? And so if it's being a vegetarian doesn't necessarily mean um, I should just eat all of these carbohydrates, right? We have a lot of our members who are more plant based, but are really really low in grains and sugar and even legumes, and finding a lot of great success that way. So yeah,
Yeah.
reminding ourselves it's about the total carbohydrates that really plays that biggest role in terms of disease progression or disease reversal. So I think that's
Hmm.
a great take home point, really. Um, and as we're kind of talking about take home points, Nita, so if you could put one nutrition myth on a giant billboard for everyone to see, what would it say?
I think you would say, don't fear the fat. Fat does not make you fat. That is a tragic homonym. Eating fat does not make you fat. It's the bagel, not the bacon, that will go to your hips.
I love that one. It's the bagel, not the bacon,
Yeah.
that will go to your hips. That's a great one. That's a great one. We might have
You
to have
can.
a competition to see which one of those wins, or we could do some testing.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
We can put up
that
some
sounds awesome.
billboards. Let's see how that goes.
Yeah, we'll just throw out some billboards and
Yeah,
see
why
what
not?
happens. That sounds good. Um, so as we are looking to wrap up our episode today, which has been really quite mind blowing as we've gone back in time. Thank you so much for sharing all of that insight. If our listeners could take away just one or two insights about how they might think about making a change, based on our conversation today, what do you hope they might remember most?
Well, I think that understanding that saturated fat is not to be feared, that even if your LDL cholesterol goes up a little bit on saturated fats, as it often does, the 5-year data show that that usually normalizes out. And there is actually a fantastic recent study that's come out showing that people on a ketogenic diet who see their LDL cholesterol go way up, those people, it turns out, have no progression of plaque. They actually did scans, and they found out that there was no plaque progression, and that is not something. Even high LDL cholesterol is not something that you need to worry about. So I'm hugely encouraged by that. There's a movie coming out on that called The Cholesterol Code. I encourage everyone interested to watch it. So really not to fear saturated fats is my top line message. And for cooking, which is something I often get asked about, I suggest butter, lard, ghee, coconut oil, suet, any of the traditional fats for cooking. I would say for cold uses like salad dressings or cold sauces, I would use olive oil. And I personally would not have those other kinds of oils in my kitchen, but of course that's up to all of you. But I think olive oil, of all the oils, olive oil, for various reasons we will not go into, but olive oil is the safest.
And olive oil is an entirely other podcast from what I'm kind of understanding from you. So maybe we can
Yeah.
have you back and just start with the 90s and the olive oil and what all brought all that to life. So that does go quite nicely with our guidance that we provide our members here as well at Verta. That whole foods, rich in saturated fat, definitely prioritize those. Definitely, like you mentioned, using olive oil in cases for more colder foods, or
Hmm.
low heat cooking. And then steering clear of those polyunsaturated oils, the corn oil, the vegetable oil, the soybean oil, as those can be pretty inflammatory. So it really does go quite nicely with what we're telling folks as well. And
Great.
providing great, there's lots of good products I think on the market too that do support that. Unless you want to make your own mayonnaise at home, haven't done it yet, but I'm really dying to try it. So
I have. It's not hard. It's definitely
okay,
worth it.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Well, again, we'll have maybe you can come back and do a cooking demo
All
sometime.
right.
Um, all right. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, Nina. I absolutely loved getting to chat with you. It's definitely been a bucket list of mine. And I hope to have you back on our show as well. And thanks again for sharing all of your insights. And we'll be sure to provide some of those links that you had mentioned and
Hmm.
some of those articles I can maybe gather from you as well after, as well as the name of that movie. So yeah, just to kind of wrap up. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Teresa. It's just a pleasure to be on with you.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. And if you'd like to regain control of your metabolic health and feel like yourself again, check us out at Virta.com. That's VIRTA.com. Your Life Reset is for informational purposes only and shouldn't be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Contact your provider if you suspect you have a medical problem. I'll chat with you all again soon. Until then, stay inspired, my friends.